A young millionaire hired a stranger to be his fake girlfriend. He never thought he'd fall for her. Lena Reese's hands trembled as she dumped the last of her apron's contents into her purse. A crumpled $10 bill, a pen, and a small notebook she used to scribble designs when no one was looking. Not that it mattered anymore. She'd been fired. Again. "I suggest you try smiling more," her manager had hissed after a wealthy patron accused her of being unpleasant when she refused to laugh at his inappropriate jokes. The words felt like salt in an already raw wound. Smiling didn't pay rent, and right now, Lena needed rent money. The biting February wind slapped her face as she stepped out of the exclusive Manhattan restaurant. The city buzzed around her, indifferent to her despair. She clutched her coat closer, her mind racing with calculations. How long could she stretch her meager savings? A week? Maybe 2 if she skipped meals. Rough day? The voice was smooth, deep, and startlingly close. Lena turned sharply, her eyes landing on a man leaning casually against a sleek black car parked just feet away. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a navy suit that looked tailored to perfection, he was the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. But his expression wasn't mocking. It was curious, maybe even amused. "Unless you've got a job offer, I'm not in the mood," she snapped, her New York survival instincts kicking in. To her surprise, the man chuckled. "Actually, I might." She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "Excuse me?" He straightened, sliding his hands into the pockets of his coat. "I couldn't help but overhear your predicament. And I happen to need someone for a job. A very specific kind of job." Lena narrowed her eyes. The last time a man in an expensive suit offered her anything, it was a scam involving investment opportunities. "Look, I don't know what you think you heard, but relax. It's nothing illegal," he interrupted, his tone calm but commanding. "It's unconventional, but perfectly above board. Let me buy you a coffee, and I'll explain." Lena stared at him, weighing her options. Normally, she'd tell a stranger like him to take a hike, but she was desperate, and he didn't seem like someone who'd waste his time with lies. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Fine. But if this is some weird pyramid scheme, I'm out." His lips quirked into a smirk. "Fair enough." The cafe was warm, the rich aroma of coffee mingling with the chatter of patrons. Lena sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup as he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Okay," she said, breaking the silence. "Talk. What's this job?" He folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "First, let me introduce myself. Theo Kensington." The name struck a chord. She'd heard it before. Something about a young tech genius disrupting the industry. "Should I know who that is?" she asked, feigning ignorance. His smirk deepened. "Not necessarily, but you should know I'm the CEO of Kensington Innovations." Lena's stomach sank. He wasn't just rich. He was obscenely rich. The kind of rich that made people like her invisible. "And you want to hire me? Why?" Theo leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "I'm about to close a merger deal worth billions, but there's a catch. The board thinks I'm a reckless playboy who can't be trusted to lead. They want proof I've matured, that I'm grounded. And where do I come in?" "I need a girlfriend," he said bluntly. "Not a real one. Just someone who can play the part for a month. Someone authentic. Someone who doesn't look like she's been plucked from the socialite circuit." Lena gaped at him. "You're kidding." "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "You're exactly what they'd never expect. Real, grounded, and completely believable." She let out a disbelieving laugh. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he countered. "I saw the way you stood up to that guy back at the restaurant. You're not afraid to speak your mind, and you have this fire. It's exactly what I need to sell this." Lena shook her head, her instincts screaming to walk away. "Let me get this straight. You want me, a complete stranger, to pretend to be your girlfriend? Why would I ever agree to that?" "Because I'll pay you $100,000, Theo said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. The words hit her like a freight train. She nearly choked. What?" $100,000, he repeated, his tone matter-of-fact. "For 1 month. All expenses covered, of course." Lena stared at him, her mind spinning. That kind of money could change her life, pay off her debts, get her back into school, maybe even start over. But this? It was insane. "What's the catch?" she asked suspiciously. "No catch," Theo said, though his eyes flickered with something she couldn't place. "Just a few public appearances, some photos, and convincing my board that you're madly in love with me." Lena laughed bitterly. "And what happens when they figure out it's fake?" "They won't," he said confidently. "Not if we play our roles well." She hesitated, the temptation tugging at her. "Why me? You could hire an actress or model for this. Someone who actually knows how to do whatever this is." "Exactly," Theo said. "And that's why they'd never be convincing. You're different. You're authentic. That's what makes this work." Lena studied him, searching for cracks in his polished exterior. He seemed so sure of himself, so certain this plan would work. And maybe it would. But could she really pull it off? "What's in it for me besides the money?" she asked, crossing her arms. Theo raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that enough?" "No," she said firmly. "If I'm going to do this, I need more. A wardrobe budget for starters. You can't expect me to look the part without it." His lips twitched in amusement. "Done. And boundaries," she added quickly. "Clear ones. This stays strictly business." "Of course," Theo agreed, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Lena exhaled, her heart pounding. She couldn't believe she was actually considering this. But then she thought of her tiny apartment, her unpaid bills, and the dreams she'd buried long ago. "1 month," she said finally. "And if you try anything weird, I'm out." Theo extended his hand across the table, his gaze steady. 1 autumn month. As their hands clasped, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil. The next morning, Lena stood awkwardly in the middle of an opulent boutique on Fifth Avenue, her eyes darting between the racks of designer dresses and the crystal chandelier twinkling above her. A saleswoman in black heels and a perfectly pressed suit hovered nearby, ready to pounce with compliments and suggestions. Lena had never felt so out of place in her life. Theo, on the other hand, looked completely at ease as he strolled through the store, inspecting dresses with a practiced eye. He'd greeted the staff like old friends the moment they walked in, and now he was flipping through price tags as casually as if he were browsing groceries. "This is ridiculous," Lena muttered under her breath, clutching her coat tightly. Around her, she felt like an imposter, a stray cat accidentally let into a palace. "I don't need any of this." Theo glanced over his shoulder, one eyebrow arching. "You're supposed to act like you belong here, remember? That means looking the part. I'm pretty sure I can convince people I'm your girlfriend without wearing a dress that costs more than my rent," she shot back. Theo smirked, clearly unfazed. "You'd be surprised how much appearances matter in my world." He held up a sleek black gown, the fabric shimmering faintly under the boutique's soft lighting. "Try this." "No, Lena." His tone was patient but firm, the way one might speak to a stubborn child. "This is non-negotiable. You agreed to do this, so let me handle the details." She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes at him. "And what if I hate it? Then we'll keep looking," he replied, unbothered. "But you won't hate it." Before she could argue further, the saleswoman swept in with a warm smile. "Shall I take this to a fitting room for you, miss?" Lena hesitated, then sighed, in defeat. "Fine, but if I come out looking like a glittery cupcake, we're done here." Theo chuckled, leaning against a nearby display as she followed the saleswoman to the fitting rooms. A few minutes later, Lena stepped out wearing the black gown, her arms stiff at her sides. The fabric hugged her figure in all the right places, the neckline dipping just enough to be elegant without feeling too revealing. She caught a glimpse of herself in the floor-length mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Theo's gaze flickered over her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence made her fidget. "Well?" she prompted, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's perfect," he said simply, his tone softer than usual. Lena blinked, caught off guard. She opened, her mouth to argue, but the words died on her tongue. Instead, she turned back to the mirror, studying her reflection. Maybe it wasn't so bad. That evening, Lena stood at the entrance to the charity gala, her stomach twisting with nerves. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns, tailored tuxedos, and champagne flutes. A live orchestra played softly in the background, the sound of violins mingling with the low hum of conversation. Theo stood beside her, exuding confidence in a midnight blue suit that must have been custom-made. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back, guiding her forward. The touch was warm, steady, and entirely too distracting. "Relax," he murmured, leaning down slightly so only she could hear. "You're supposed to look like you've done this 100 times. Easy for you to say," she muttered, forcing a smile as a pair of older gentlemen nodded in their direction. "You're used to this. I'm just trying not to trip over my own feet." Theo chuckled, the sound low and rich. "You're doing fine. Just stick close to me." They moved through the crowd, Theo effortlessly slipping into conversations with business magnates, socialites, and even a senator. Lena nodded and smiled when appropriate, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was staring at her, silently judging her presence at Theo's side. And then, she appeared. Victoria. The woman was stunning, with sharp cheekbones, waves of honey-blonde hair, and a gown that looked like it had been poured onto her. She approached with the kind of confidence that could part seas, her red lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Theo," she purred, her voice smooth as silk. "It's been too long." "Victoria," Theo replied, his tone polite but cool. "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight." "Of course," she said, her gaze flicking to Lena. "And who is this?" Lena straightened, forcing herself to meet Victoria's gaze. "Lena Reese," she said firmly, extending her hand. Victoria's smile widened, but there was something predatory about it. "Ah, the mysterious Lena. Tell me, where exactly did Theo find you?" Lena bristled at the thinly veiled insult, but, before she could respond, Theo stepped in. "Lena and I met through mutual friends," he said smoothly, his hand tightening slightly on her back. Victoria said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, it's lovely to meet you." She turned, back to Theo, lowering her voice just enough that Lena could barely hear. "You always did have a thing for surprises." Lena's jaw tightened, heat rising to her cheeks. She wasn't about to let Victoria dismiss her like some passing fad. "Surprises can be wonderful," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "Especially when they outshine the predictable." Victoria's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but before she could respond, Theo let out a low laugh. "If you'll excuse us," he said, steering Lena away. As they moved toward the balcony, Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Does she always look at people like she's sizing them up for a fight?" "Victoria thrives on competition," Theo said, his tone neutral. "You handled her well." The crisp night air was a welcome relief as they stepped onto the balcony. The city sparkled below, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance. Lena leaned against the railing, closing her eyes for a moment. "You seem to handle pressure better than I thought," Theo said quietly, his voice closer than she expected. Lena opened her eyes, glancing at him. "I've had practice." For the first time since they'd met, his confident mask seemed to slip. "It's exhausting, isn't it?" he murmured, his gaze distant, constantly trying to be what everyone expects. She studied him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Yeah," she said softly. "But sometimes you have to stop caring what they think." Theo turned to her, his expression unreadable. Easier said than done. Their eyes met, the moment stretching longer than it should have. Lena's heart skipped, and she quickly looked away, focusing on the glittering skyline. She couldn't afford to forget what this was. A business arrangement, nothing more. But as Theo stood beside her, silent and steady, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lines between them were beginning to blur. The next morning, Lena woke up to the sharp trill of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She groaned, pulling a pillow over her head, but the noise persisted. Reluctantly, she reached for the device, squinting at the screen. Her heart sank. The words, Theo Kensington and mystery woman spark romance rumors at gala, blared across a celebrity news alert, accompanied by a photo of her and Theo on the charity gala's balcony. In the shot, Theo was leaning in close, his hand on the small of her back, while she gazed up at him with a look that, unfortunately, could definitely be interpreted as smitten. Great, Lena muttered, tossing the phone back onto the nightstand. As she sat up, this wasn't part of the deal. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "It's open," she called, running a hand through her disheveled hair. Theo stepped in without hesitation, his suit already immaculate despite the early hour. He held a tablet in one hand, the other tucked casually into his pocket. "Have you seen it?" he asked, his tone calm but clipped. "If by it you mean the circus on my phone, then yes," she replied, crossing her arms. "Care to explain how this happened?" Theo's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "The paparazzi were outside the gala. It was bound to happen." "Bound to happen?" she repeated, incredulous. "You didn't think to warn me about this part of the job?" "I didn't think it would escalate this quickly," Theo admitted, setting the tablet on the desk. The screen displayed several headlines, all variations of the same theme. Theo, Kensington's new love interest. Is she the one to finally tame the billionaire heiress magnet? Lena groaned, sinking back onto the bed. This is a disaster. What if people start digging into my life? I don't need strangers analyzing my every move. Theo's expression softened, and he crouched slightly to meet her eyes. I'll handle it. My PR team will put out a statement. All you need to do is stick to the plan. And what's the plan exactly? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Theo straightened, his commanding presence returning. We're leaving for my family estate this afternoon. The board needs more than public appearances. They need to see stability in my personal life. That starts with my parents. Lena froze. Your parents? He nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. It's critical. My father's opinion carries weight with key board members. If he believes in this relationship, they will too. Right, because convincing a man I've never met that I'm madly in love with his son will be so easy, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Theo arched a brow. Are you saying you can't handle it? Lena bristled at the challenge. I didn't say that. Good, he replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Pack a bag. We leave in an hour. The estate was nothing short of breathtaking. Sprawling grounds stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with manicured gardens, fountains, and even a small lake. The main house, a stately Georgian mansion with towering columns, loomed ahead like something out of a period drama. Lena stepped out of the sleek black car, craning her neck to take it all in. This isn't a house. It's a museum, she muttered under her breath. Theo appeared at her side, his expression unreadable. Welcome to my childhood. Before she could respond, the grand double doors opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and imposing, his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, his tailored suit as sharp as Theo's. His eyes, however, were cold and calculating as they raked over Lena. Father, Theo greeted, his tone clipped. Theo, his father replied, his voice low and authoritative. His gaze shifted to Lena, lingering just long enough to make her squirm. I assume this is the young lady I've heard so much about. Yes, Theo said, his hand brushing against Lena's in a subtle gesture of reassurance. This is Lena. Lena forced a smile, extending her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Kensington. His handshake was firm but brief, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The pleasure is mine. I must admit, I'm curious about the woman who's managed to capture my son's attention. Tell me, what is it you do? Besides, accompanying Theo, of course. Lena's stomach tightened, but she kept her smile in place. I'm a designer, she said evenly. I've been working on building my own brand. Interesting, Mr. Kensington replied, though his tone suggested the opposite. Father, Theo interjected, his voice laced with warning. Perhaps we could continue this conversation over dinner? Of course, his father said smoothly, gesturing toward the house. Shall we? Dinner was a tense affair. The dining room was cavernous, the long mahogany table set with crystal glasses and gleaming silverware. Lena sat beside Theo, acutely aware of the scrutiny from his father at the head of the table. "So, Lena," Mr. Kensington began, swirling his wine, "what inspired you to pursue design? Surely it's an unpredictable career choice." Lena stiffened, but met his gaze head-on. "I've always been passionate about it. I believe in creating things that bring joy and meaning to people's lives. A noble sentiment," he said, though his tone was anything but. Theo, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "Lena's work is exceptional. She's one of the most driven people I've ever met." His father raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Forgive me. But I find it hard to imagine what someone like Lena sees in a man like you, Theo." The comment hung in the air like a grenade. Lena's chest tightened, anger bubbling to the surface. "With all due respect, Mr. Kensington," she said, her voice steady but firm, "Theo is one of the most intelligent and hard-working people I've ever met. Maybe you've been too busy criticizing him to see it, but I haven't." The room went silent. Theo stared at her, his expression unreadable, while his father regarded her with a mix of surprise and something that almost resembled respect. "Well," Mr. Kensington said after a beat, setting down his glass, "it seems you're not afraid to speak your mind. I'll give you that." Later that evening, Lena found Theo on the terrace, leaning against the stone railing. The moonlight cast soft shadows across his face, and for once, he looked vulnerable. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Yes, I did," she replied, stepping closer. "He was out of line." Theo let out a humorless laugh. "That's just how he is. Nothing I do is ever good enough for him." Lena hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "For what it's worth, I think you're more than good enough." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Lena, this wasn't part of the deal. You're not supposed to make me care." Her breath hitched. "You're not supposed to make me care either." The tension between them was palpable, electric. Before she could second-guess herself, Theo closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender. For a moment, the world fell away, leaving only the two of them under the moonlit sky, and then reality crashed back in. Lena pulled away, her heart pounding. "We can't." Theo's gaze was intense, his voice low. "Why not?" "Because I'm terrified," she thought, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving Theo alone on the terrace. The next morning, Lena woke to a gentle knock at her door. She sat up slowly, her mind still tangled with the events of the previous night. Theo's kiss lingered in her thoughts like an unresolved melody, and the weight of her own conflicting emotions pressed heavily on her chest. She hadn't slept much after walking away from him on the terrace, her mind spinning with what-ifs and the growing realization that her feelings were no longer under her control. "Lena, it's me," Theo's voice called softly through the door. She froze. Part of her wanted to ignore him, to let the whirlwind of emotions settle before facing him again. But part of her also knew that avoiding him wouldn't solve anything. "Come in," she said, her voice steady even though her heart wasn't. Theo stepped inside, his expression unusually hesitant. He wasn't the self-assured, polished man she'd grown used to. There was something raw in his eyes, as if he'd been carrying the same restless thoughts she had all night. "I need to show you something," he said simply. Lena raised an eyebrow. "Now?" "Yes," he replied firmly. "It's important." She hesitated, searching his face for clues. When she found none, she sighed and swung her legs over the side of the bed. "Give me a minute to get dressed." An hour later, they arrived at a sleek modern building in the heart of Manhattan. Theo hadn't said much during the drive, which only heightened Lena's curiosity and her nerves. She followed him into the elevator, the soft hum of classical music doing little to ease the tension between them. When the elevator doors opened, Lena stepped out into a space that took her breath away. The penthouse was bathed in natural light pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a stunning view of the city skyline. But it wasn't the luxury or the view that left her speechless. It was what filled the room. Everywhere she looked, there were easels, canvases, and shelves stocked with art supplies. A drafting table stood near the windows, surrounded by brushes, paints, and sketchbooks. In the center of the room sat a vintage leather chair paired with a sturdy wooden stool, as if waiting for her to take her place. Lena turned to Theo, her eyes wide. "What is this?" He stepped closer, his hands tucked into his pockets. "It's yours." She blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Mine?" Theo nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I remembered you mentioned wanting your own studio someday. I realized I had this space sitting empty, so I thought, why not make it happen now?" Lena's throat tightened as she looked around again, taking in every detail. It wasn't just a studio. It was her dream, brought to life in ways she hadn't even dared to imagine. "Theo, this is too much. I can't accept this." "Why not?" he asked gently. "You deserve it." She turned to him, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Because this kind of thing doesn't happen to people like me. I'm not someone who gets penthouses and art studios handed to them." Theo's expression softened, and he reached out to take her hands. "You're someone who's worked hard for everything you've ever had. Someone who's passionate, talented, and 100 times more deserving than anyone I've ever met. This isn't about me trying to buy you or impress you, Lena. This is me giving you the space to chase your passion. No strings attached." His words hit her like a wave, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She wanted to argue, to push him away, but the sincerity in his voice and the openness in his eyes left her defenseless. "Why are you doing this?" she finally whispered. Theo took a deep breath, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "Because you make me want to be better. Not for my father or the board, but for you. I've never felt this way about anyone before, Lena. And I don't want to let you go." Her heart swelled at his confession, but it also ached with fear. "Theo," she said quietly, pulling her hands away. "You don't understand. I'm not like you. I don't belong in your world. I was so scared of losing myself in all of this that I didn't realize I'd already found the one person who sees me. But that doesn't change the fact that we're from two completely different worlds." He stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "That doesn't matter to me. I don't care about the world I come from, Lena. All I care about is you." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her stomach sinking as she read the notification. "Breaking. Kensington's girlfriend exposed. Sources claim relationship is fake." Her blood ran cold. "Theo," she said, holding up the phone. "Look." He took the phone from her, his jaw tightening as he read the headline. "Victoria," he muttered, his voice laced with anger. "This has her fingerprints all over it." Lena's heart pounded. "What do we do? If the board finds out—" "Let me handle it," Theo interrupted, his voice firm. "I'll fix this." "How?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You can't just make this go away, Theo. And even if you could, it doesn't change the fact that this, us, was never supposed to be real." Theo's expression darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might say something to argue. Instead, he simply nodded. "Give me time," he said, before turning and walking out of the penthouse. The next day, Lena's anxiety was through the roof. The story had already spread like wildfire, with every outlet dissecting her and Theo's supposed arrangement. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, old acquaintances, and even strangers who claimed to know the truth. She was pacing the studio, trying to figure out her next move, when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from a live newsfeed. Her breath caught as she saw Theo standing at a podium, surrounded by flashing cameras and microphones. The headline read, "Kensington holds press conference amid scandal." She quickly clicked on the live stream, her heart in her throat. "I'm here today to set the record straight," Theo began, his voice steady but intense. "Yes, Lena and I started our relationship under unconventional circumstances. But what started as a necessity became something real, something I wouldn't trade for anything." The reporters erupted with questions, but Theo raised a hand to silence them. "I've spent my life trying to live up to expectations. My father's, the board's, society's. But for the first time, I'm doing something for myself. I love Lena Reese. And if loving her costs me my reputation or my position, then so be it. Lena's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, or the depth of what he was risking for her. Before she could stop herself, she grabbed her coat and bolted out the door. She had to find him. She had to tell him that she felt the same way, that she was done running from the one person who had never stopped believing in her. When she arrived at the conference, Theo was stepping away from the podium, his expression resolute despite the chaos around him. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Lena pushed through the crowd, her heart racing. When she reached him, she didn't hesitate. "You're an idiot," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You didn't have to risk everything for me." Theo smiled, his eyes softening. "Yes, I did." She let out a shaky laugh, tears spilling over. "I love you, Theo. I think I've loved you for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it." He cupped her face in his hands, his gaze locking onto hers,